A man with terminal cancer was abandoned by his wife and daughter. Years later, they came back to claim the inheritance, but they had no idea what awaited them. Roman stared blankly at the window of the doctor's office, but he saw nothing. The image of the park outside, with the trees gently swaying, was blurred by the cold sweat that covered his forehead. The doctor had stopped talking seconds ago, maybe minutes, but the words still echoed in his mind like an endless refrain. Terminal cancer. The air seemed to have thickened, as if the weight of his fate was slowly suffocating him. Sitting in the chair, Roman gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't move. The doctor looked at him with compassion, but Roman didn't care. There was nothing left to say. His world, which he had built over so many years of hard work, seemed to collapse in front of him in a matter of seconds. He felt a tremor run through his body, not from the fear of death, but from something worse, the fear of facing his family. "Roman, I know this is hard to process." The doctor's voice broke the silence like shattering glass. "But there are options, palliative treatments that can give you more time." Time. That was all he had left. But for what? Roman nodded mechanically and walked out of the office as if he were walking through thick fog. Each step toward the car felt heavier than the last. He knew the hardest part was yet to come, talking to Silvana and Romina, but something inside him told him that conversation wouldn't go as he needed it to. When he got home, the sound of the door closing echoed in the emptiness of the house. Silvana was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables without paying him much attention. Romina, his 20-year-old daughter, was in the living room, absorbed in her phone, without lifting her gaze. Roman took a deep breath and approached the kitchen table. He felt like he was about to open the door to something far more terrifying than death. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely audible, broken by tension. Silvana didn't respond immediately. Roman noticed how her hand paused for a second in midair before continuing to chop, as if something inside her had anticipated what was coming. Romina didn't even look up. The atmosphere filled with an uncomfortable tension. "What is it?" Silvana finally asked, without looking at him. Roman closed his eyes for a second, trying to find the strength to say the words that hurt him so much. "I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer." The knife in Silvana's hand stopped moving. Romina dropped her phone, but her eyes remained focused on the screen, as if her father's words had bounced off an invisible barrier. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Roman waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Maybe a show of concern, a word of encouragement, a hug. But none of that came. "How much time do you have?" Silvana asked, with a coldness that chilled his soul. Roman blinked, incredulous. Silvana had always been a pragmatic, straightforward woman, but the indifference in her voice was unbearable. "I don't know. It depends on the treatments, but it's not curable," he replied weakly, feeling as if his body grew heavier. Silvana placed the knife on the table and turned to face him, crossing her arms. "This changes everything, Roman. How are we going to survive now?" she asked, without a trace of empathy. "The bills, the expenses. You were the one who took care of everything." Roman felt a stab in his chest, but it wasn't his illness tormenting him at that moment. It was the complete lack of compassion in the words of the woman who had been his partner for more than 20 years. The woman with whom he had built a family. Romina finally looked up, but there were no tears in her eyes, no fear, no concern. There was something much harder to process. Indifference? "And what are we going to do?" Romina asked in a hollow voice. "Mom's right. If you can't work, who's going to support us?" Roman's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. At that moment, he realized that although his body was sick, what would truly destroy him was the lack of love, the emotional betrayal of those he loved the most. He was alone in a fight that required more than any medicine or treatment. "I thought," Roman stammered, unable to finish the sentence. I thought maybe we could spend this time together. Support, be together. Roman, Silvana interrupted him with a chilling calm. We can't afford to take care of you. If you can't support us, we'll have to find other options. I can't carry this alone. Roman looked at his daughter, searching her face for some trace of the little girl who used to run to him when she fell or was scared. But Romina had grown up, and all he saw in her eyes was the reflection of Silvana, the same cold and calculating selfishness. We'll have to sell the house, Silvana said. We can't live here with your medical debts. Roman felt his world collapse around him. In that moment, there was no longer any doubt. His family wasn't willing to walk with him through his last days. They were ready to abandon him just when he needed them the most. And the worst part was, they did it without even blinking. Roman felt a wave of despair, followed by a fury he had never experienced before. His life, his sacrifice, everything he had done for them, meant nothing. The silence that followed was long, uncomfortable. He knew that what came next didn't matter anymore. Everything had changed. You don't have to worry about me, Roman said finally. I'll take care of everything. I won't ask you for anything. Silvana looked at him for a moment, as if assessing the truth of his words. Then she nodded. There was nothing more to discuss. Romina went back to her phone. The echo of abandonment resonated in the empty house, even though they were all still present. Roman slowly turned and left the kitchen, with a mix of pain, anger, and resignation growing inside him. He climbed the stairs, his body weary, but his mind, for the first time in months, was clear. Something inside him changed at that moment. The fear of death was replaced by a cold determination. If he was going to die, he would do it on his own terms, without relying on anyone. But if he survived, if he overcame this, his life would take a course no one in that house could imagine. The silence of the night enveloped him as he locked himself in his room, but his mind didn't rest. From that moment on, he would begin to plan his rebirth. The sun had barely begun to light the horizon when Roman left the house. The city, still asleep, did not reflect the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. He walked with a firm step, despite his body still feeling the effects of the illness. But it wasn't the physical weakness that occupied his mind. Something more powerful stirred within him. The need to be reborn, to rebuild himself in silence, away from those who had betrayed him. It had been a month since that conversation in the kitchen. Silvana and Romina continued to live as if nothing had changed, as if the news of his imminent death didn't matter to them. Roman watched silently, never mentioning his illness again, keeping his promise not to ask anything of them. But inside, a strategy was taking shape. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall. He arrived at the hospital early, where the doctor was waiting for him. That day wasn't just another routine checkup. Roman had made a decision that would change the course of his life. He knew the experimental treatment offered no guarantees, but it was his only option. Not to save himself from cancer, but to prove, both to himself and to his family, that he still had control over his destiny. The doctor greeted him with a look of understanding, as if he could read the mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. Roman, this treatment is aggressive, but we've seen promising results in other patients, the doctor said in a tone meant to be reassuring, though it was laced with caution. You have to be prepared for the worst, but don't lose hope. Roman nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the table. For him, there was no other option. He wasn't afraid of what was to come, not after everything he had experienced with Silvana and Romina. The physical pain was insignificant compared to the desolation he felt each day in his own home. I'm ready, he said firmly, without hesitation. The treatment began that same week. The first sessions were devastating. Roman spent hours in bed, alone, without receiving a word of encouragement from his family. Silvana barely spoke to him, and when she did, it was about trivial matters like household expenses or the state of the garden. Romina, lost in her own world, didn't even notice her father's long absences. One afternoon, while Roman was recovering from one of the most painful sessions, he heard Silvana talking on the phone in the living room. At first, he didn't pay much attention, but as Silvana's words filled the silence of the house, Roman began to feel that something was off. Yes, of course, I'm alone now. Roman won't last much longer, you know that. Her voice was low, but clear enough for him to hear through the slightly ajar door. We talked about this before. When it's all over, we can be together. Don't worry. Roman's heart pounded. For a few seconds, he couldn't process what he had just heard. Who was Silvana talking to? What did she mean by be together? The betrayal he had felt that day in the kitchen came back to suffocate him, but this time it was much deeper, much more painful. Silvana hadn't just abandoned him emotionally. She was already planning her future with another man before he was even dead. Roman felt the air in the room grow thick, but he made no sound. He returned to the bed, closing the door carefully, while Silvana's words kept echoing in his mind. It was no longer just about his illness, about his fight to survive. There was something darker, deeper, that he had to confront. Silvana wasn't just a distant wife. She was betraying him at the most vulnerable moment of his life. The following days were a nightmare. The treatment sessions drained Roman to the point of leaving him without strength. Sometimes, while he lay in bed, his body aching and his mind consumed by uncertainty, he would hear Silvana continue talking to that man, always with the same cold tone, always with the same promise of a future without him. The treatment began to show results. Against all odds, Roman started to regain his strength. Though still weak, his body was responding little by little, and his mind became clearer with each passing day. But with that clarity came a new, much firmer resolution. Silvana and Romina would know nothing of his improvement. The weak Roman they saw would gradually disappear, but not in the way they expected. One day, as he headed to another session, Roman ran into Jorge, his old friend and lawyer, someone who had been out of his life for years, but whose presence at that moment felt like a stroke of fate. "Roman, what's happened to you?" Jorge asked, surprised by his friend's gone appearance. Roman wasted no time. He felt the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. He needed Jorge for the next phase of his plan. "Jorge, I need your help," Roman said with calculated calm. "I can't trust anyone else." Jorge, though surprised, listened in silence as Roman told him everything. The illness, his family's abandonment, Silvana's secret conversations. What Roman was proposing wasn't just a way to protect his assets, but a strategy to dismantle the world Silvana believed she had under control. A plan to expose the truth and make it clear that he would not be a man defeated or forgotten. "I want you to help me prepare everything in secret. No one can know. Silvana can't find out until it's too late," Roman said, with an intensity in his eyes that Jorge had never seen before. "I'll do what you ask," Jorge replied, still processing the magnitude of what his friend was planning. "But Roman, are you sure about this?" "More than ever," Roman replied, with unwavering determination. As the weeks went by, Roman continued with the treatment, improving day by day. No one in his house noticed the changes. Silvana was too busy with her calls, and Romina, absorbed in her virtual life, barely crossed paths with him in the hallways. Roman used their indifference to work in the shadows, creating with Jorge's help a financial structure that would protect him from any of Silvana's maneuvers. He had become invisible to his own family, but invisible didn't mean weak. One night, while they were eating in silence, Roman finally spoke. "I'm going to need a few things in the coming days. There will be more treatments, more expenses. But don't worry, I've got it covered," he said, looking directly at Silvana. She looked at him with a slight expression of surprise. For weeks, he had acted as if he were on the verge of death. Why did he suddenly seem so confident? "Are you sure you can handle that?" Silvana asked, her voice trying to sound casual, but there was an underlying tension. "Absolutely sure," Roman replied, without breaking eye contact. "Everything is under control." Dinner continued in silence, but Roman knew the game had just begun. The air in the house had changed. Silvana and Romina lived in a comfortable indifference, convinced that Roman's fate was sealed. His appearance remained fragile, and although his health hadn't deteriorated as much as they expected, it didn't seem to improve significantly either. Roman, always observant, concealed his emerging strength behind a facade of weakness. He knew the time to act hadn't yet arrived, but something in the atmosphere suggested the end was near. Months later, Silvana received an unexpected call. It was Jorge, Roman's lawyer, coldly announcing the news she had long been expecting, but which hit her with an unexpected weight. Roman had passed away. It took Silvana a few seconds to process what Jorge was saying. On the other end of the phone, her face remained expressionless as her mind began to scheme. "Is everything in order with his will?" Silvana asked, avoiding any tone of emotion, her voice low and calculated. Jorge listened in silence, fully aware that Silvana was not interested in Roman's well-being or his death, but in what was left after him. He assured her that everything was under control and that the will would be read in a few days. Before hanging up, a faint flash of satisfaction crossed Silvana's face. "Finally," she whispered, as if speaking to herself. When Romina arrived home later that afternoon, her mother was waiting for her in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. The atmosphere was different. Romina noticed it immediately. "Your father is dead," Silvana said bluntly. Romina didn't show an immediate reaction. She looked at her mother, searching for some hint of sadness or remorse, but found nothing. Emotions were buried beneath layers of indifference and, perhaps, relief. Romina sat down across from her, in silence, processing what this news meant. "And now what?" Romina finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Now, we deal with what's ours," Silvana responded with a coldness that would chill anyone's blood. "The inheritance. What he left. Jorge will read it in a few days. It belongs to us, Romina." Romina nodded slowly. There was no doubt about her mother's priority. Since Roman had fallen ill, everything Silvana had done was calculated to ensure none of the fortune slipped through her fingers. Though Romina had always been more passive, influenced by the security her mother projected, something inside her stirred. The news of her father's death hadn't shaken her as it should have, perhaps because she had already written him off long before he stopped breathing. But there was something about all this that didn't feel right. The following days passed with growing tension in the air. Roman's funeral was small, almost empty, attended only by Silvana, Romina, and Jorge. There were no tears, no heartfelt words, just a formal, distant goodbye. But just when both women thought everything was under control, things began to take a turn they hadn't anticipated. The reading of the will took place in Jorge's office. Silvana and Romina arrived with an apparent calm, though both knew that what was at stake was much more than just a legal document. When Jorge received them, his expression was unusually neutral, sparking a slight unease in Silvana. "Thank you for coming," Jorge said as he laid out the will in front of them. Roman left very specific instructions regarding his inheritance, and I want to make sure everything is understood clearly. Silvana exchanged a quick glance with Romina, as if expecting a quick procedure that would grant them full control of Roman's fortune. But Jorge, unfazed, began to read what would change everything. "Roman set certain conditions for you to receive your share of the inheritance. He didn't want it to be simply distributed without more." Jorge paused, weighing the impact of his words. You will have to fulfill a series of specific actions. Silvana raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected this. Her hand tightened around the glass of water in front of her, but her face remained composed. Actions? What kind of actions? She asked, her voice growing tenser. Roman left clear instructions, Jorge continued. He wanted each of you to fulfill certain commitments before any sum of money is transferred. For you, Silvana, he requires you to make a significant donation to a charity foundation he supported during his final months. And Romina, Jorge paused, looking directly at Roman's daughter. Romina must reconcile with someone she betrayed years ago. The silence that followed was thick. Romina felt the color drain from her face. She knew exactly what Jorge was referring to. That episode in her life, which she had tried so hard to bury, was now resurfacing, brought back by a man she thought no longer had any power over her life. Reconcile? Romina asked, trying to maintain her composure. Yes, Romina. Roman was very clear about this. He wanted you to face that part of your life before receiving any inheritance. You must find that person and make amends for what happened, Jorge said firmly. The air grew heavier in the room. Silvana abruptly stood up, leaving her chair with an expression oscillating between fury and disbelief. This is ridiculous. What kind of game is this? She demanded, glaring at Jorge. That money is ours, no conditions. Jorge remained calm. These are Roman's final wishes. If you're not willing to meet them, there will be no inheritance. Romina's face tightened. She remembered perfectly well whom she would have to face. Tomas, a former friend she had betrayed at a crucial moment. They had shared a deep friendship until money and social pressure led her to betray him in a business deal that would benefit her and her mother more. Since then, Tomas had disappeared from her life, broken by the betrayal, and she had done everything she could to forget that dark part of her past. Silvana, on the other hand, couldn't believe she would have to part with some of the money in a donation. For her, it was all part of the control she had worked so hard to gain. And now, even from the grave, Roman had the last word. I'll make the donation, but I won't be happy about it, Silvana growled, her teeth clenched. Romina said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than any words. She knew she couldn't avoid what was coming, and though she tried to remain firm, a fear she couldn't control began to grow inside her. When they returned home, the atmosphere was charged with an almost unbearable tension. Silvana drank in silence, while Romina sat, staring at her phone. Jorge's words and her father's demands kept bouncing around in her head. The house, which had been a symbol of power and control until then, now felt like a prison. Romina took a deep breath and stood up. She knew what she had to do, but facing it would be much harder than she imagined. Romina hadn't been able to sleep since the reading of the will. Every time she closed her eyes, Tomas's face appeared in her mind, hardened by the betrayal and pain she had caused him years ago. The thought of facing him, of reliving that part of her life, filled her with anxiety she couldn't control. She knew she had to fulfill the condition if she wanted to receive the inheritance, but something inside her also understood that this was much more than money. It was an emotional debt she had been avoiding for far too long. Silvana, on the other hand, was furious. The conditions imposed by Roman were not just an inconvenience. They were a humiliation. Making a significant donation, a public display of generosity, was the last thing she wanted. Money was power, and giving it up to comply with her late husband's posthumous whims only fueled her resentment towards him. She had spent the days since the reading of the will looking for ways to fulfill the condition without losing too much, searching for legal loopholes she could exploit. But Jorge had been clear. There would be no inheritance without strictly following what Roman had stipulated. In the morning, Romina made up her mind. She knew she couldn't keep putting off the inevitable. She sent a message to Tomas, asking to meet. She knew he would probably reject her, but she had no other choice. The hours dragged on until she finally received a response. "Meet me tomorrow, same place." Romina's heart raced. Same place referred to the old park where they used to meet when they were inseparable friends. Tomas's choice to meet her there was another blow. She knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. Meanwhile, Silvana was on her own mission, cold and calculated as always. That same afternoon, she made the donation Roman had demanded, but with such bitterness that even the secretary at the foundation looked at her uncomfortably. For Silvana, every move was another step toward the inheritance, but also toward the culmination of her plan with the man she had been secretly involved with. Roman's death should have been her liberation, but instead, she now found herself carrying out his final orders. The tension between mother and daughter was palpable. Romina had reached a point where she could barely stand being around her mother. She felt that, in some way, everything that was happening was a consequence of Silvana's decisions and manipulation, which had shaped her life to distance her from any sense of morality or real compassion. But now, Romina found herself in a dilemma, trapped between fulfilling her father's wishes and the fear of confronting what she had done. The next day, Romina headed to the park. The fresh air only heightened her nervousness. She walked slowly, dreading what was about to happen. When she arrived, she saw Tomas sitting on a bench, waiting for her. He had changed, more mature, hardened by the years. When he saw her approach, he didn't smile. He showed no emotion that might suggest a desire for reconciliation. "Hi, Tomas," Romina said, breaking the silence between them. Her voice trembled slightly. Tomas looked at her, not responding immediately. Years had passed since they last saw each other, but the pain in his eyes was clear. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want, Romina?" he asked, with a coldness that cut through her. Romina swallowed hard. She knew words wouldn't be enough, that no apology could undo what she had done. But she also knew she had to try, if only for her own redemption. "I know I don't have the right to ask you this, but I've come to apologize for everything. What I did was unforgivable. I betrayed you in the worst way, and not a day goes by that I don't regret it." Tomas listened in silence, showing no visible reaction. His eyes remained fixed on her, as if he were weighing every word she said. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice filled with suspicion. "Why after all this time? Why do you care now about what you did to me?" Romina felt the weight of the question. It was exactly what she had feared. "It's my father. He left a condition in his will," she began. But when she saw Tomas's expression harden even more, she stopped. "So, this is about money," Tomas said, his voice now tinged with contempt. "You haven't changed at all, Romina. You're only here because you need to meet a condition to get your father's inheritance. If it weren't for that, you never would have thought of me." Romina felt a stab in her chest. She knew Tomas was right. She had come because it was required, but at the same time, she couldn't deny that she was also doing it for something deeper, something she had been avoiding for years. The need to redeem herself, to try to mend what she had broken. "It's not just about the money," she said softly, trying to find the right words. "I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I really am." Tomas stared at her, and in that moment, something in his expression changed. It wasn't forgiveness, but maybe it was an acknowledgement that Romina's words were genuine. Or perhaps, after all these years, the pain he had carried was starting to fade slowly. "What you did can't be undone, Romina," Tomas said, his voice calmer now. "But if this helps you find some peace, then fine." Romina felt a slight weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew this was only the beginning of a long process. Tomas hadn't forgiven her, but at least he had opened a door, however small. Back at home, Silvana watched Romina with a calculating look. There was something in her daughter's demeanor that she hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. And instead of comforting her, that vulnerability infuriated her. "Did you do it?" Silvana asked, her voice sharp. "Did you grovel enough to secure the inheritance?" Romina looked at her, surprised by her mother's harshness. For years, she had endured Silvana's emotional control, but this time something inside her rebelled. "It wasn't to secure the inheritance, Mom," Romina responded, her tone firm for the first time. "It was for me. I needed to do it for myself." Silvana let out a bitter laugh. "Don't kid yourself, Romina. This has always been about money, and you know it. Don't act all moral now. If it weren't for the inheritance, you wouldn't have lifted a finger to fix anything." Silvana's words hit Romina hard, but something inside her didn't give in. For the first time, she saw her mother for who she really was. A woman consumed by greed and resentment, incapable of feeling remorse or compassion. "I don't want to be like you," Romina said with a firmness that surprised them both. The silence in the house was deafening. Silvana stared at her, incredulous, as if she couldn't process what she had just heard. Romina, without waiting for a response, walked upstairs. For the first time in years, she felt she had reclaimed a small piece of herself. Meanwhile, in Jorge's office, a sealed letter bearing Roman's name awaited its moment. It wasn't just a final will. It was the last piece of a plan no one had anticipated. The sound of the rain hitting the windows created a heavy atmosphere inside the house. Romina, sitting at the kitchen table, couldn't get the meeting with Tomas out of her mind. Although the conversation had been painful, something inside her felt that, somehow, she had begun to free herself from the burden she had carried for so long. But that relief was faint and temporary, because she knew the internal struggle with her mother was only just beginning. Silvana, from the other side of the room, watched her daughter in silence. The relationship between them, always tense, was now on the verge of breaking completely. Silvana didn't understand the change she had seen in Romina. The vulnerability, that display of remorse she had shown toward Tomas, was a sign of weakness that she despised. For her, the only things that mattered in life were power and control, and seeing her daughter start to question that same worldview enraged her. "So, you did what Roman asked," Silvana said, breaking the silence with an acidic tone. "Congratulations. I suppose you feel like a better person now?" Romina didn't respond immediately. She knew her mother was looking for a confrontation, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to play that game. But the patience she was trying to cultivate was fragile, and Silvana always knew how to push her to the limit. "I did it because I needed to, not for the inheritance," Romina replied calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. Silvana let out a bitter laugh. "That's what you always say. But everything you've ever done in life has been out of convenience, to get what you want. Or have you forgotten how you betrayed Tomas for money? You're not so different from me, Romina." Romina clenched her fists under the table. Her mother's words cut deep, not only because they were cruel, but because, deep down, she feared there might be some truth to them. But something had changed in her since her father's death. Romina was beginning to realize that life couldn't continue being a game of manipulation and betrayal. "Maybe I was before," she responded, looking directly at her. "But I don't want to be anymore." Silvana watched her for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of disdain and something deeper, something Romina couldn't decipher. "You're still a naive little girl if you think life is about redemption. The only thing that matters is power and what you can get before the world takes it from you." Before Romina could respond, the sound of the phone broke the tension. It was Jorge. Silvana quickly answered, her expression immediately shifting to the cold, professional tone she used for anything related to the inheritance. "What's going on?" she asked impatiently. On the other end of the line, Jorge spoke in a grave voice. and what he said made Silvana frown. "I received a letter from Roman. There's something both of you need to know. I suggest you come to my office today." Silvana hung up without saying anything more and turned to Romina, her expression revealing a mix of frustration and concern. "Jorge says there's more. Something your father left. We have to go now." Romina felt uneasy at the idea. After everything that had happened, she didn't know if she was ready to face another of her father's surprises. But she had no choice. They grabbed their things and headed to Jorge's office without exchanging any more words. When they arrived, Jorge was waiting with an envelope in his hand. He ushered them in and closed the door behind them, creating a claustrophobic feeling in the small office. Romina noticed that Jorge's expression was more tense than usual. Something wasn't right. "This envelope was given to me by Roman before he died, with clear instructions not to open it until both of you had fulfilled the conditions of the inheritance," Jorge said as he slid the envelope across the table toward them. "And now that you've done so, it's time for you to know the truth." Silvana looked at him with a mix of impatience and confusion. "What truth?" she asked, not hiding her irritation. Jorge slowly opened the envelope and pulled out several papers that appeared to be legal documents. Romina felt her heart race as the lawyer began to read. "Roman wanted both of you to know something before any other decisions regarding the inheritance were made. He wanted you to understand why he made the choices he did at the end of his life." Jorge paused, as if deciding how to proceed. "Romina, Roman is not your biological father." The silence that followed was devastating. Romina felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Everything in her world, everything she had taken for granted for years, was a lie. Her mind couldn't process what she had just heard. "What?" she whispered, unable to raise her voice. "What are you saying?" Jorge didn't look her in the eyes as he continued reading. "Roman found out years ago that he wasn't your biological father. Silvana, before you were born, had a relationship with another man. Roman discovered this but decided to raise you as his own, hoping that one day the truth would come out. Roman never wanted this to destroy your relationship, but he believed that both of you needed to know after his death." Romina felt the air grow thick around her. She looked at her mother, searching for an answer, some sign that this was all just a misunderstanding. But Silvana's face was pale, her lips tight. She didn't deny anything. "It's true," Silvana finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Romina couldn't believe it. Her whole life, she had believed that Roman was her father, and though their relationship had never been perfect, she had always felt a connection to him. Now, all of that felt like a sham, a fragile construction her mother had kept secret for years. "Why?" Romina asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" Silvana looked at her, but there was no remorse in her eyes, only an impenetrable coldness. "Because it didn't matter," she replied. "Roman raised you as his own. It never mattered who your biological father was. But for Romina, it did matter. Her mother's betrayal, the fact that she had lied to her all her life, felt like a dagger to the heart. Everything she thought she knew, all the decisions she had made, were based on a fundamental lie." She stood up abruptly, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere in the office. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling with rage and pain. "I can't stay here." Romina ran out of the office, leaving her mother and Jorge behind. The cold wind hit her face as she tried to hold back the tears that blurred her vision. Her life had just become unrecognizable. Nothing made sense. Everything she had known, every decision she had made, was now tainted by the lie of her origin. In the office, Silvana remained seated, her expression unchanging. Jorge watched her for a moment, trying to decipher what she was feeling, but he couldn't find any trace of remorse in her eyes. "You knew this the whole time," Jorge said quietly, "and yet, you kept it hidden." Silvana didn't respond. simply standing up slowly and leaving the office without looking back. For her, the secrets didn't matter, only the control she could maintain over them. But what she didn't know was that this secret, now revealed, would be the beginning of her own downfall. The air in the house was suffocating, laden with an unbearable tension that spread through every corner. Romina had spent the last few hours locked in her room, trying to process the devastating truth she had learned in Jorge's office. Her whole life, her relationship with her mother, her bond with Roman, now felt like ghosts of a reality that had never existed. The pain she felt was so deep that she couldn't even cry. She was empty, broken, unable to find meaning in her existence. Silvana, on the other hand, continued behaving with the same coldness as always. To her, everything that had happened was just another complication to be handled. Romina had learned the truth, yes, but there was nothing she could do about it. Life went on. The money and the inheritance were still within reach, and that was the only thing that mattered. That night, Romina decided she could no longer stay under the same roof as her mother. She walked down the stairs with the determination to leave it all behind, to flee from the toxic presence of Silvana, who had manipulated her since she could remember. Silvana watched her from the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, as Romina reached the bottom of the stairs. "Where do you think you're going?" Silvana asked without looking up from her glass. Romina stared at her, a mixture of anger and sadness in her eyes. She was not going to let her mother control her any longer. "I'm leaving. I can't stay here anymore. I have nothing to do with you anymore," Romina replied, her voice firm despite the pain she felt. Silvana let out a dry, emotionless laugh. "And what do you think you're going to do? Run away from everything because you don't like the truth? Roman raised you as his daughter. Nothing that's happened changes that." Romina clenched her fists, feeling the anger consume her. "Everything changes, Mom," she shouted, her voice charged with suppressed emotions. "You lied to me my whole life. You shaped me to be like you, to betray, to manipulate, to use people at my whim. Roman didn't leave me the inheritance so I could become another version of you. He wanted me to redeem myself, to understand what truly matters. And that, what he tried to teach me, is the only thing I have left now." Silvana set her glass down on the table with a sharp motion. Finally, she stood up and walked toward her daughter, looking her in the eyes with an expression radiating disdain. "Do you really think you're better than me?" Her voice was cold, cutting. "Everything you have, everything you are, is because of me. I did everything to secure our future, so we wouldn't depend on anyone. And now, you want to leave it all behind for some morality you don't even understand?" Romina shook her head, feeling how her mother's words no longer penetrated her heart. Silvana no longer had any power over her. "What you did wasn't for me. It was always for you. For your ambition, your greed. And if staying here means continuing to be like you, I'd rather have nothing," she responded firmly. Before she could take another step, the front door suddenly swung open. Jorge entered, his face grave and determined. Silvana looked at him with a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clearly annoyed. Jorge walked toward them, holding an envelope in his hand. Romina recognized it immediately. It was another one of the letters her father had left. The lawyer spoke with a calm voice, but with a seriousness that captured both of their attention. "Roman left one last letter. I couldn't read it before now because there were specific instructions to wait, but I think it's time for both of you to hear it." Romina's heart began to race. What else could her father have left? Silvana, though visibly uncomfortable, said nothing as Jorge opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter from Roman. Jorge's gaze was intense as he began to read. "Silvana, Romina, if you're hearing this, it's because you've reached the end of the path I set for you. My death wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of the truth you both needed to face. Silvana, your betrayal, your manipulation, your ambition, everything you built came at the expense of those who loved you. Romina is not your tool. She is not your extension, nor your creation. She is her own person, and you have spent her entire life shaping her in your image. But that ends today. Romina felt a wave of emotions wash over her as she listened to her father's words. There was weight in every sentence, making her realize that even in death, Roman had tried to protect her, to guide her toward a different future. Jorge continued reading. Romina, I know what you've discovered has shattered you in many ways. But the truth is that, despite everything, you were always my daughter. My love for you was never less because you weren't of my blood. I wanted you to know this because it's important for you to understand that family isn't defined by biology, but by the choices we make and the people we choose to care for. I chose to be your father, and I never regretted that decision. Romina felt the tears start to fall down her face. Her father's words wrapped around her, a mixture of sadness and comfort. Despite everything, Roman had been her real father, and that was all that mattered. Finally, there's something that must be made clear. Silvana, the control you've sought your whole life ends here. The inheritance you so desire will not be yours. I have left it to Romina, but under one condition. She must cut you out of her life completely. Only then can she find her own path and free herself from your influence. The impact of those words hit the room like a bomb. Silvana stood frozen, her face filled with disbelief and rage. That can't be true. You can't take what's mine. Silvana shouted, losing control. But Jorge looked at her calmly. Roman made everything clear in his will. If Romina accepts, everything will be hers. If not, the inheritance will go to a charity. You will receive nothing. Romina looked at her mother, who now resembled a cornered animal, her dark eyes filled with hatred and desperation. She could see how everything Silvana had built throughout her life was crumbling in a matter of seconds. The control she had always maintained was slipping away before her eyes. Romina, you can't do this. I'm your mother, Silvana said, her voice now tinged with panic, an emotion Romina had never seen in her. Romina took a deep breath. Her whole life, she had lived in her mother's shadow, following her rules, betraying the people who mattered to her. But now, she had the chance to break free, to find her own path, and she knew she couldn't let that opportunity slip away. No more, Mom, she said firmly, though the tears continued to fall. I'm not going to be part of your world anymore. I choose myself. Silvana screamed, her voice desperate and full of rage, but Romina didn't hear it anymore. She walked out of the house, leaving behind everything she had known. As she closed the door, she felt a liberation she had never experienced before. Her life, at last, was her own. As she walked through the rain, the echo of her father's words accompanied her. She had suffered, yes, but she had also learned. And now, she had a second chance to truly live, free from the chains her mother had built around her. Roman had given her the greatest gift of all, freedom. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments what you would do in a similar situation. We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep uploading exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly value having you here with us. You can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Big hugs.